Hi there everyone. In this bite-sized bit, we're going to discuss how to create branching logic in our Visual Studio projects, also known as if statements. Let's go ahead and get started. For today's example, I've created a brand new project called Bank Balance. The form and the code that we're going to write is reasonably simplistic. For the form, we're going to have a single text box which is going to collect our bank balance from the user, called txt bank balance. We have a submit button so the user can submit their bank balance. And then behind the scenes, what we're going to do to elucidate how if statements work is we're going to evaluate that bank balance and determine whether it's what we consider a low bank balance, a medium bank balance, a high bank balance, or any other category that we can kind of imagine. So let's go ahead and look at the code behind the scenes. I've only just gotten things started. I did add my required header information for this bank balance project, which I'm going to collapse. And I wrote some code for my submit button, basically the stubs for my input and my output. For my input, I'm collecting information from the text property from my text box on my form, and I'm converting it to a decimal value and storing it in a variable called DEC bank balance. I've also created an empty variable called strMessage. It currently has a value of null, but I'm going to be using that variable in processing to create my output. And then you can see in my output section that I'm going to use a message box to show the result of that strMessage to the user when we're done with our processing. So that's our structure for today. Let's go ahead and jump into our very first branching or if statement. In the processing area of my submit click method, I'm going to type the word if. I'm then going to type an open parenthesis, and Visual Studio will add the close parenthesis for me. Inside the parentheses next to an if statement, the programmer has to type something that can be evaluated as a true or a false value. This can be a value from a form, a variable. This can be an equation of some sort. This could be a list of different values that are connected with ands or ors, which we will discuss in detail in the classroom. Really, anything that can be evaluated as a single true or false at the end of the day would satisfy the requirements for this evaluation location for our if statements. For our purposes, I'm going to type a fairly simple inequality to evaluate. I'm going to ask Visual Studio if my DEC bank balance is less than or equal to 100. And I'm going to add the letter M. If you've been coming to class, you know when we deal with decimal values, we have to include that M suffix for decimal values. I'm asking Visual Studio to evaluate this statement. Is the value of our variable, DEC bank balance, 100 or less? Visual Studio is going to evaluate that statement and respond with a true or a false. After our if statement, I'm going to add some open and close braces. And this first set of open close braces represents what the code is going to do if the evaluation of the if statement resulted in a true. So whatever I type here, and it can be one or more lines of code, will only run if DEC bank balance is less than or equal to 100. And what I'm thinking here is I'm going to type strMessage is equal to your bank balance is very low. This is an example of an if statement with only a true branch. So in this case, nothing happens if DEC bank balance is greater than 100. The only thing we're evaluating is bank balance less than or equal to 100, and that's where our strMessage would get changed to your bank balance is very low. Optionally, we can add a false branch. After the braces for the true section, we could add the word else, and then we could add some more open and close braces and type a new message. So perhaps here we would type your bank balance is high. This second component is a false branch. It only runs if the evaluation in the if statement comes up as false. So in this case, if our bank balance was more than 100, then we would run to the else branch and we would set our str message to your bank balance is high. This is optional. You don't have to have an else branch for your if statement. However, you must have a true branch for your if statement. So if you were ever tempted to create code that looked like the following, where nothing happens when the question is evaluated as true, but something happens when the question is evaluated as false. This is poorly structured code. We'd never want to see this. What we'd want is we'd want the logic to always run in the true branch, and we'd want to eliminate the false branch. So what we might see instead would be the following. I would move str message to your bank balance is high, and I'd move it into the true branch. I'd eliminate the optional false branch, and I would just change my question. In this case, instead of less than or equal to, I'll change it to greater than. I'm flipping the question on its head so that I have the mandatory true branch, and I eliminated the optional false branch. Never write code where your true branch is empty. If that's the case, flip things on their head and create a mandatory true branch. I'm going to revert to my earlier code and then continue from there. All right, so we're asking the original question, is your bank balance less than or equal to $100? And if so, your bank balance is very low. Otherwise, your bank balance is high. What if we want to have more granular evaluations of our bank balance? So instead of just asking the one question, we want to ask more than one question. For instance, if your bank balance isn't less than or equal to 100, but it's still a small value, let's say $250, instead of writing an if-else statement, we could write an if-else-if statement. So instead of this else, I'm going to tack an additional if, and I'm going to write a new question. In this case, I'm asking if your bank balance is less than or equal to 250. Now let's think about the logic. I'm asking this question as a follow-up to my first question. It's the else branch of my first question, which means I'm only going to ask this question if my bank balance is greater than 100. And I might remind myself of that. Bank balance is greater than 100. I can't ask this question if the bank balance is less than or equal to 100, because I would be pursuing the true branch of my first question and not the false branch. If the false branch is triggered, I can ask if your bank balance is less than or equal to 250, and that means inherently that it is greater than 100. If you wanted to, you could add that additional statement. But this second component to this question is actually superfluous. You don't need it. You can't get to this question if the first question wasn't evaluated as a false. So you don't need to check if the bank balance is greater than 100. If you would like to include it for readability's sake, or because it helps with your mental process, that is perfectly fine. But you don't need to add it from a logic standpoint. In this case, if your bank balance was between 250 and 100, I might argue that your bank balance is medium. And maybe we'll even do one more of these just to illustrate the point. Else if your DEC bank balance is less than or equal to 500, we'll say that your bank balance at that point is high. And then maybe we add one more catch-all for bank balances that are even higher than 500. I do an else without the if. Your bank balance is very high. Obviously, all of these evaluations are something I've just come up with for this example. You could set the numbers to any range that you want. You could change the message to anything that you want. All we're trying to do here is suggest how branching might work. And in this case, we have multiple true-false statements that are being evaluated in sequence. You can't get to the else if unless the question that precedes it came up with a false. So hopefully you can work through the logic here and see how everything should proceed. If statements are great for breakpoint analysis. I'm not going to do it in this video, but I strongly recommend you run this code with breakpoint analysis using our favorite F11 key to watch how the different inputs can cause different results and how you move through the if statements. It is very elucidating to watch the if statements proceed through different branches based upon different inputs. But that's something that you should experiment with outside of this video. We'll take a look at more complicated logic statements in future videos. Looking forward to it. Thanks everyone. See you next time.